We've had several people on the program today about whom it's said that they don't really need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce a third of those people, or a fourth of those people. Susanna Loeb is the Barnett Family Professor of Education at Stanford University and a Director of Policy Analysis for California Education. And she is also she was the coordinator of a set of studies that were conducted in 2005-2006 called Getting Down to Facts. And for those of you who were paying attention back in 2005-2006, Getting Down to Facts really was the genesis point, the sort of origin story for the local control funding formula. And Susanna and some of our philanthropic partners have decided that 10 years in, 10 years after the original Getting Down to Facts, it would be useful for California, particularly in an election year, to look at the facts again. And so Susanna is now coordinating Getting Down, the very cleverly titled Getting Down to Facts 2, the sequel. So she's going to talk to us for just a few minutes about what's involved in the study and what she hopes to accomplish with this new project.
Well, David just said everything I was going to say, so now I'm like, oh, okay, what am I going to say? But hello, and thanks for having me here. I hope you've really enjoyed the PACE conference today and gotten a lot out of it. While I'm talking about Getting Down to Facts, I really am part of the whole PACE undertaking as well. So this is just a preview. I actually don't have any results or anything like that to share with you, but I am going to talk about this Getting Down to Facts 2. So as you know, over the past 10 years, California has enacted a whole range of new policies, which we've been talking about, particularly for kind of in the pre-K to 12 public school system. So we've got the new academic standards and assessments and transforming accountability and shifting towards a more decentralized system of governance and finance. And these big shifts followed the prior set of research that we did, particularly this Getting Down to Facts 1, on kind of effective practices for improving teaching and learning. The prior work pointed to some important needs in California, the need to reform. As one example, Getting Down to Facts showed that California had kind of the most restricted finance system in terms of districts having very little control of how to use the finance that they had. It was also really quite irrational at the time, and I think we've rationalized it a lot more since then. But we've had all these big reforms, and as a result, there have been a whole bunch of big changes, and they were instituted in what everyone's been talking about today, which is this idea of continuous improvement. And as a result, because there have been so many big changes, we're at a point where we kind of want to know what we need to do to take them to the next stage, and that's where this fits in. It's also a good time to think about doing this because we're going to have a new governor and superintendent of public instruction. And so what our hope is that we would take this 18-month period before the changes, or really a 2-year period before the political changes, as a time to collect as much information as we can about the reforms that have gone on already, where we are, what's happening with the implementation, so that when the new administration comes in, we're in a really good spot to kind of discuss in productive ways the best ways of moving forward. So like in the first round of Getting Down to Facts, we really are trying to focus as much as possible on the facts. And, we can disagree to some extent about what there's some information that's not going to be perfect, and there'll be interpretation, but the idea is not to say this is what we should do, but more this is where we are, so that we're at least in agreement on that as we discuss what the approaches should be for going forward. So the kinds of questions that we're asking are things like, what is the status of California's current policy framework? Kind of, what are the goals? This is very focused at the state level. So what are the goals? What kinds of policies have been enacted as a result of those goals? And then second, how have they been implemented? So we're, not surprisingly, we'll do a bunch on LCFF and the implementation of LCFF. Who's receiving what, how have the policies kind of impacted what's happened on the ground. Then we're interested in what evidence can we find about how effective those policies have been, what seems to be working and what doesn't seem to be working, and then what steps could be taken to implement them more fully and effectively in the future. So it's kind of, all of that is very focused on what the state has kind of defined as its policy approaches so far, how the implementation of that is going, and how that can be improved. We're also going to look at what hasn't been addressed by the state. Are there areas that we haven't worked on so much that seem from the evidence in the field to be important areas to work on? And then for all of these, what are the human capital needs that we have? What kind of capacities do we need to do these things well? So with this goal in mind of trying to provide this information, we've pulled together about 35 studies. So it's a huge number of researchers and studies who have really been coming together, and we've tried to get as much feedback as we can. Many of the researchers are here today. But to address these questions. And we've organized them into 4 key areas. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is student success in California. So that's really a question of how California students are doing, not only on average, but different groups of students defined by income and ethnicity and race and geographic region. How are students doing on the metrics set by the state, particularly on achievement and graduation and things like that? But then we're also looking at some kind of other kinds of measures that are supposed to capture a broader range of skills. So how are students doing? And we're looking at this for students in the system and also in the early childhood side. So for the students entering the system, how are we doing there? So we've got the student success, which kind of frames what our needs are in terms of improvement. Then we've got a full section, not surprisingly, on finance. So what are we doing in terms of overall adequacy, in terms of resource equity? Are we getting the funds to the places with the highest need and the highest cost in the way that we should? Then we have a bunch, some of which you've heard about today, on the effects of LCFF. And we have special studies on pensions and on special education, not surprisingly given their importance for funding and the dynamics that are going on there. So we've got student success and we have finance. The third area is on governance and continuous improvement. And here I'm not going to list all the studies, but we're really looking at the governance. Part of it is on the governance structure, so what the state structure does that supports educational improvement, how the county and district structures are working, what charter schools are in here as well. So we're looking at the chartering and oversight of charter schools. So there are those structures, and then there's more on the implementation side. So the implementation of the standards, what kind, do we have the supports that we need for effective implementation of the standards, for the effective implementation of LCFF, those kinds of things. And then the third area in this governance structure is just on transparency and data. So one of the areas that we highlighted in the first round of Getting Down to Facts is that relative to other states, California was not very transparent. It was hard to see what was happening, and we're going to be writing a bit about that in this project as well, on kind of what we can learn from the data that's available in California relative to what other states are able to do and relative to what might be considered best practices, and also what kind of data at the local area is really useful for school improvement. Then the final section is on personnel, and this is just probably what you would expect, which is kind of what are our needs in terms of the recruitment and training of teachers and principals, their development on the job. We're doing a bit with a specific focus on mental health services in the schools and our capacities there. So those are the general structures. To inform the research, we tried to get as much input from stakeholders as we possibly could, both to understand interest and then to understand different perspectives and understandings about what's actually going on in the system. So we've been trying to reach out to a bunch of groups to get input on the questions that are important, but we've also conducted some data collection efforts that are used across the studies. So we've interviewed about a random sample of about 100 superintendents across the state. We're working similarly on chief budget officers. We have surveys that Rand's done for us with teachers and with principals in the state, and we're hoping with the School Boards Association to have surveys of HR directors and school board members as well, so that we're really getting kind of multiple perspectives on what's going on. So that's all coming together, as well as the use of the administrative data, and then each researcher's own research. So when we've designed these papers, we kind of had 3 goals in mind, or these reports. And the first is that we want it to be rigorous. So we want people to bring to the questions that we have at hand. So let's say we were doing special education finance. The best information we can from the research that's out there and from the data that's out there, and we're going to bring it together and we're going to have these reports. But we also want these reports to also be really useful. So it's not only information, but it's information targeted at improvement. And then the third characteristic is that it's accessible. So we really want these to be there so that people, all the people in the room, as well as in the rest of the state, can use them. And part of that is that the report should be quite accessible, but the other is that we have a whole process after the reports. So we're going to have these 35, don't hold me to that number, it's around there, 35 reports, and then in groups, some is just one per report and some is in groups of reports, we're going to do these research briefs that kind of pull out the main findings of this set of reports. We're going to have a couple that are focused specifically on issues of equity, but more typically they're going to be pulling things together like the finance or the governance or something like that. We're going to have, so you could read those reports if you want, you could read the research briefs which summarize the key findings, and then we're going to have a summary paper that kind of pulls out the main things from it. And One more question. Someone has to have a last question. None? Okay, Terry.
Just interested if the studies and researchers are listed on a website or something in case people want to talk about preliminary results and some of the work that we're doing here now.
Yeah, oh, that's a good question. We don't currently have the website up, but we should very soon, and that list is available. If you would like it, just send me an email and I can get that to you. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking about it more once we really have results.